Under the blazing Namibian sun, the flags of Africa fluttered gently across the marble courtyard of Windhoek's Grand Convention Center. Delegates from every corner of the continent had gathered, men and women, generals and peacekeepers, presidents and poets waiting for history to speak once again. And then she walked in, the first woman ever to lead Namibia, a nation once born out of struggle, now standing tall as the land of the brave. Her voice carried not just across the room, but across generations. Women do not need to be invited to the table. They only need space to lead. In that single sentence, the air shifted. It wasn't just a speech, it was a declaration of freedom, not from colonial chains this time, but from silence itself. On this day, as the world marked the 25th anniversary of the United Nations Resolution 1325, the one that first recognized women as agents of peace, Namibia reminded the world that true peace cannot exist when half of humanity is left outside the door. The hall stood still. Former presidents of Liberia, Ethiopia, and South Africa rose to their feet, eyes shining with something between pride and remembrance, because they knew every battle fought by men had been carried in silence by women. But the question still lingers for us all in Washington, in Paris, in Nairobi. Have we truly learned that peace is impossible without equality? And are we ready to let women lead the world into a new era of cooperation and justice? If you believe that the story of peace is incomplete without women, if you believe that Africa is not just surviving but leading, then stay with us, because what happened in Namibia may change the way the world defines leadership forever. Subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than headlines. It was more than a ceremony, it was a reckoning with history. In Windhoek, the capital of Namibia, the hall shimmered with golden light as hundreds of delegates stood beneath the blue, red, and green flag of the land of the brave. The occasion, the 25th anniversary of the United Nations Resolution 1325, a document that changed how the world understood war and peace by declaring that women must be part of the peace process. And standing at the podium that day was the embodiment of that declaration, Namibia's first female president. Calm, composed, yet powerful in presence, she opened with words that instantly silenced the crowd. Women do not need to be invited to the table. They just need space to lead. It wasn't rhetoric. It was lived truth born from decades of struggle. Because in Namibia, the story of women in peace is not theory. It is blood memory and sacrifice. When Namibia fought for its independence in the 1970s and 1980s, women were not hidden behind the scenes. They carried ammunition through the desert. They nursed the wounded in underground clinics. They organized diplomacy in exile, negotiating with the United Nations for international recognition. Some never returned. Others lived to see their children vote in the first free elections supervised by the UN in 1990, an election that became a global model for peaceful transition. And now, decades later, those same ideals had brought Namibia back to the center of the world stage. As the president spoke, she turned from the podium and gestured toward the front row where former female heads of state sat: Liberia's Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Ethiopia's Sahle-Work Zewde, and others who had once faced ridicule for daring to lead. Her voice softened. "I proudly stand on your shoulders." The room erupted in applause, not polite applause, but the thunderous, emotional rhythm of recognition. These were not politicians celebrating themselves, these were survivors saluting one another. From there, the speech moved into substance. The president explained why the women, peace, and security agenda must never remain symbolic. She outlined its 4 pillars: participation, protection, prevention, and recovery, calling them the architecture of lasting peace. Each word landed like a stone in a riverbed building, a foundation for something permanent. Women are not victims of war, she said. They are agents of peace. She reminded the audience that while global institutions often celebrated progress on paper, implementation was still painfully slow. Documents without action, she warned, are as good as if they do not exist. The crowd murmured in agreement. The ministers of Isadsi, the Southern African Development Community, nodded as she mentioned their ongoing efforts to mediate crises in Madagascar and the Democratic Republic of Congo. But she made one thing clear: Africa would no longer wait for external actors to write its peace agreements. Too often, peace deals brokered by outsiders have excluded women, ignored local wisdom, and erased lived experience, she said. Without women at the table, peace will always remain incomplete. In that moment, her words carried far beyond Windhoek. They reached every war-torn village where women have carried both their children and their countries on their backs. They reached the conference rooms of New York, where peace talks are too often dominated by men in suits. For Namibia, the event was not a commemoration, it was a recommitment. The president announced the creation of the Namibia International Women's Peace Center, a hub for training diplomacy and intergenerational mentorship across Africa. Its mission to keep the spirit of Resolution 1925 alive, not in speeches, but in policies, classrooms, and battlefields of ideas. And as she closed that first part of her address, her tone shifted from celebration to challenge. "Let us not honor the past with words," she said. "Let us honor it with courage." The hall fell silent again. In that stillness, even the most powerful among them seemed humbled, because in Namibia that day, a nation once liberated by struggle had just redefined what liberation means. Then came the moment that would etch this day into history. The president paused, looked across the hall, and her tone changed. The warmth of ceremony faded into the gravity of truth. She spoke not just as a leader, but as a witness. "Let us remember the women of Palestine," she said softly, "who continue to endure suffering under occupation, displacement, and hunger. Their resilience is a testimony to our shared humanity." The hall fell into absolute silence. Even the translators in their booths stopped breathing. You could feel it, the weight of conscience pressing down on every corner of that room. And then she added, her voice trembling but unbroken, "Their pain reminds us of our collective failure to uphold the promises of international law and human dignity." For the first time in years, a sitting African head of state had said out loud what many feared to whisper, that the global peace order has failed its most vulnerable, women and children caught between the ambitions of men. As the cameras zoomed in, the audience could see tears glistening in the eyes of older diplomats, veterans of Rwanda, South Sudan, and Gaza. She didn't stop there. "We must not forget the women of Western Sahara," she continued, "who still await the day the United Nations resolution for a referendum will be fulfilled." At that instant, her voice broke through borders. It was no longer just about Namibia or Africa, it was about the universal wound of injustice. The applause came not as thunder, but as a long rising wave, first hesitant, then overwhelming. Even some Western envoys visibly uncomfortable moments earlier now stood up. In the crowd, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia, nodded slowly. She had once been labeled unfit to lead. Now, from her front row seat, she smiled because she understood that what was unfolding wasn't merely a speech. It was a generational transfer of defiance. The Namibian president continued, turning her attention back to the continent. "In the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Mozambique, in Madagascar, we call for peace, and we trust the strength of African diplomacy to deliver it." The mention of SADC, the Southern African bloc, drew strong applause. These were not empty words. Under her leadership, Namibia had already dispatched 2 female envoys to mediate in Madagascar's crisis, proving that women could navigate war rooms just as effectively as men. Her message was unmistakable: Africa will no longer outsource its peace. Then came the crescendo, a declaration that electrified the audience. "Namibia has nominated Major General Anna Maria Nainda, a woman, to lead Interpol." Gasps rippled through the room. The symbolism was powerful: an African woman not just defending peace at home, but leading the world's largest police organization. The president's voice grew stronger. "If Namibia is trusted to lead, we will not fail the world." Thunderous applause erupted. The sound reverberated through the marble hall, echoing like the pulse of a continent reclaiming its voice. The camera panned across the faces of young Namibian cadets standing at the back, some saluting, some crying, realizing that they were witnessing a new chapter of African history, written not by generals, but by mothers, teachers, and peacemakers. Outside, the streets of Windhoek were alive with music. Screens across Africa streamed the speech live in Accra, Dakar, Nairobi, and Ouagadougou. Hashtags like Ma's Peace Has a Her Face and Mahad Land of the Brave trended within hours. And yet the power of that moment wasn't in the applause. It was in the unspoken realization spreading across the continent that peace is not passive and leadership is not inherited. It is earned through courage and empathy. When the president finally stepped back from the podium, the crowd rose again, not in ceremony, but in unity. Even the visiting male presidents from neighboring countries bowed their heads. For once, Africa's most powerful men were applauding not themselves, but the woman who had just reminded them that true strength is measured by the courage to include. That afternoon, the Namibian sun blazed higher over the capital as if saluting the birth of a new kind of revolution, one that began not with gunfire, but with grace. The morning after the speech, Windhoek awoke to a new kind of silence, the kind that follows revelation. Across Namibia's radio stations, talk shows replayed her words again and again. Markets opened later than usual as vendors gathered around battery-powered radios. In classrooms, teachers played the speech for students, pausing to discuss every sentence. It was as if the entire nation had inhaled the same breath of possibility. For the Namibian people, this was not simply pride, it was a mirror. For decades, their mothers had been peace builders without recognition. They had negotiated truces between villages, buried their dead, and rebuilt homes from ruins. Now, for the first time, the world had acknowledged that legacy in the most public way possible. Within days, the ripple turned into a movement. Universities in Windhoek and Swakopmund announced the establishment of Women in Peace Leadership Fellowships, scholarships for young women studying diplomacy, security, and international law. The Ministry of Defense opened new recruitment pathways for female officers. Civil society organizations launched campaigns under a shared slogan, "Peace begins when women lead." Inside Parliament, a special resolution was passed declaring 2026 the Year of Women and Youth in Peace. It called for gender parity across government institutions and for women's representation in all future national negotiations, from energy deals to regional mediation. It was more than symbolism, it was legislation. Meanwhile, across southern Africa, other nations began to move. Botswana, Zambia, and Tanzania formally endorsed Namibia's proposal to institutionalize a Women's Mediation Council within the Southern African Development Community, SADC. The idea was simple but revolutionary, that any peace negotiation in the region must include women at every stage, from ceasefire talks to reconstruction. African newspapers from Lagos to Lusaka carried headlines that read, "Namibia redefines peace. A woman's voice reshapes African diplomacy." But not everyone applauded. Some conservative figures in politics and clergy circles criticized the speech as too radical, claiming it risked diluting traditional structures. Yet for every skeptical voice, 1,000 more rose in defense. Women's groups across Africa, from Nigeria's market unions to Kenya's civil rights forums, declared solidarity with Namibia's vision. The momentum reached Geneva and New York, where UN officials began citing the speech as a model of transformative leadership. The UN Secretary-General personally called to congratulate the Namibian president, describing her address as a blueprint for the next 25 years of the global peace agenda. Domestically, something even deeper began to change. In small towns like Katima Mulilo and Rundu, where post-war poverty still lingered, women started organizing community peace forums, informal councils, where they mediated local disputes, often succeeding where police could not. The government's new peace center, announced in the speech, began training these grassroots mediators, mothers, teachers, and nurses, equipping them with tools of negotiation and trauma healing. The political consequences were equally profound. Namibia's international standing soared. Within months, the country was invited to co-chair the African Union Committee on Women, Peace and Security. And in an unprecedented gesture, several Western embassies, including France and Canada, pledged financial support for Namibia's peace initiatives. But the most powerful change could not be measured in numbers or treaties. It was visible in faces, young girls who for the first time said they wanted to be diplomats, not models, peacemakers, not observers. In one interview, a Namibian high school student put it best: "Before we thought peace was something men decided. Now we know peace is something we can build." In the span of a few weeks, a single speech had evolved into a national awakening. And in that awakening, Africa had found something the world had almost forgotten: the quiet strength that turns equality into destiny. While Namibia celebrated, the world began to listen and in many ways to reflect uncomfortably. In the days following the president's speech, headlines rippled across continents. The Guardian called it a defining moment for African feminism. Al Jazeera described it as the speech that restored faith in moral leadership. But it was the response from the West, and particularly the United States, that revealed something deeper about the world we live in today. American media outlets from PBS to The Atlantic replayed the speech with surprise and admiration. Many commentators admitted that while the U.S. often preached gender equality abroad, Namibia had quietly achieved what Washington still struggles to do at home: elect a woman to the highest office not as a symbol, but as a servant of purpose. Namibia didn't wait for permission, wrote one columnist in the New York Times. It simply did what many established democracies are still afraid to do: trust women with power. In universities across America, professors of political science began citing the address as a model of post-colonial governance and moral clarity. Students in gender studies watched it alongside speeches by Eleanor Roosevelt and Malala Yousafzai, placing the Namibian president among history's global truth-tellers. The United Nations, for its part, praised Namibia's proposal for the Women's Peace Center and urged other nations to replicate it. In Brussels, members of the European Parliament called for a renewed partnership with Africa grounded in equality, not dependency. Even the Vatican, in a rare public comment on African politics, described the moment as a sign that moral leadership is no longer confined to the old world. Yet behind the praise, the speech stirred quiet discomfort among Western policymakers. Her words, "Too often peace deals brokered by outsiders have excluded women," struck close to home. It was a subtle indictment of decades of foreign interventions that sidelined local voices, especially those of women. For Africa, this moment rebalanced the narrative. For too long, the continent had been treated as a classroom for Western ideals. Now it was Africa and a woman president giving the world a lesson in integrity and inclusion. In the corridors of the African Union, diplomats whispered that something new was taking shape: a soft power of empathy capable of challenging the cynicism of global politics. For the first time, Africa's leadership wasn't defined by military strength or resources, but by its moral authority. And in the United States, many older Americans, veterans, pastors, and mothers found something deeply familiar in her message: the conviction that peace begins in the heart, not in the boardroom. They saw in Namibia's story a reflection of America's own struggle, the long, unfinished journey toward equality and moral courage. "Maybe this is what leadership looks like when it's not about power," said one retired diplomat on CNN. "Maybe it's about listening, and that's something America needs to remember." As the world debated her words, one truth became undeniable: Namibia's voice had transcended geography. What began as a regional anniversary had become a moral mirror for the world, revealing both its failures and its hopes. And somewhere between Washington and Windhoek, a quiet realization emerged that the future of peace might no longer be written by those with the loudest armies, but by those with the clearest conscience. As the evening sun descended over Windhoek, the golden light fell across the faces of hundreds of young women gathered outside the conference hall. Some were holding small Namibian flags, others were simply standing still, eyes lifted toward the building where history had just been rewritten. You could almost feel it, the shift from applause to awareness. Something permanent had begun. Inside, the final echoes of the president's speech lingered in the air: "Let us honor the past by strengthening the present. Let us secure the future by investing in our women and youth." Those words were more than ceremonial. They were a warning and a promise. A warning that peace, if left in the hands of a few, will crumble again. A promise that when women and youth are empowered, peace can endure beyond any border or generation. Across Africa, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, people felt that call. This wasn't just Namibia's moment. It was a continental awakening. The president's voice had rekindled a truth older than any constitution: that the world's survival depends on balance, empathy, and shared responsibility. But her message also reached across oceans. It touched America's heartland, where many older citizens, veterans, mothers, pastors watched the clips online and quietly nodded. They understood the subtext: peace without justice is illusion, and justice without equality is hypocrisy. The world stands now at a crossroads. In one direction lies the familiar path led by power, dominated by a few, fragile and temporary. In the other lies a harder road built on inclusion, compassion, and the courage to listen. Namibia has chosen the second path. The question is, will the world follow? Because, as she reminded us, peace is not a gift from the powerful, it's a responsibility shared by all. And if this century is to survive its wars, its hunger, its disinformation, it will require something the old systems never taught: the leadership of conscience. So tonight, as you watch this story from your home in America, in Europe, in Asia, ask yourself, can there be peace without women? Can there be equality without truth? If your answer is no, then share this message. Share it for every mother who carried her child through war. Share it for every young girl who still dreams of leading her nation. Share it because peace deserves a new face, and that face today is Africa's. Please share if you feel you are one of the first to witness this awakening. Subscribe if you believe that truth is more important than headlines. Because somewhere in the heart of Africa, a woman has reminded us all that real power is not domination. It's inclusion.